as many of you know, we went to Ghana in January of this year, the 12th through the 21st. So I actually want to start off by saying thank you, because Westminster was one of the sponsoring congregations that's helped to fund us to be able to go on this trip. So it's really from your generosity that we even had this opportunity to take this intercultural trip. So I just want to say thank you to all of you for the ways that you give to this congregation and the work that you continue to do. So we're just going to go through a couple of our pictures throughout the trip and sort of speak on.
It's a very loud mic.
Sort of chronologically,
It's being streamed, so you have to use
who has sound?
Right here. You just need to talk.
Okay, well, that's too loud.
You're
Okay.
doing great now.
That's too loud. So we'll just talk through a couple. If we did every single photo that we took, we'd be here for hours, because it was really a beautiful place and lots of opportunities to take photos. So we're just going to hit some highlights here. And my mother's running to the back because she is the slideshow.
So this was when we left, obviously. I can't remember what airport this was. I think it was Dulles. This was the group we went with. I wish I had a pointer thingy, but on I guess your left, on the far left is Hunter Farrell, Dr. Hunter Farrell, who is the director of the World Mission Initiative at Pittsburgh Theological Seminary. He, along with Bala Kailep, who went on a different trip in January, organize all of these trips. They spend all year planning these trips, gathering itineraries, forming partnerships in the countries or locales that students are sent to, and we were lucky enough that he was going to be on our trip. Closer to my mouth. Got it. And so they do a lot of work on these trips. I mean, when we signed up for this trip, we were handed an itinerary that was to the hour for 8 days with various partners on the ground in Ghana. So a lot of work goes into these trips. The next to him is Reverend Dr. Anne Marie Mingo. She's the professor of ethics at Pittsburgh Theological Seminary, and also the director of the Metro Urban Institute. And she's been to Ghana several times and is a really lovely professor. She's brilliant, and so it was such a gift to have her. She was our main professor on this trip, because the trips are also an academic fulfillment. And I think, and then one more person. 2 more people? Well, yes, I was going to say there was one more person to talk about. 2 people over. He's in a bunch of white. He stands out because he's wearing white pants, and the quarter zip he's wearing is Pastor Ben Niti. Ben is from Ghana, and he's a Peace USA pastor in Johnstown, Pennsylvania, and also an alum of the trip. He was probably the most important person in our group because he was our cultural bridge the entire time we were there. Okay, Jennifer, next.
Okay, so this is like only a couple of hours after we had landed in Ghana. If it's a good thing this is far away, because if you zoomed in, like, we were dead. Like, we were so tired because that flight was so long. How long was it? It was,
I mean, 9, 10 hours. We flew direct from Dulles to Accra, Ghana. So our layover was Dulles from Pittsburgh. so it was very long.
Yeah, so something that that we found out in doing this trip is that there's actually a growing Ghanaian community in the United States, and there's a growing sort of Ghanaian economic ties between the U.S. And Ghana. And so there's much more access to West Africa generally and to Ghana more specifically than there may have been even 5 years ago. So if you're picturing the continent of Africa, Ghana is sort of on the bottom of the hump of Africa. It is the first country on the continent to gain independence from a colonial power, and it has been the most stable nation on the continent for as long as it has been in existence. So it's never gone through the same sort of turmoil and upheaval that other countries even now are facing. They're actually the most stable nation on the continent at this point. So we're at this sort of trendy restaurant in Ghana. The man who's sitting closest to us in the blue, who's Isaac, yes, Isaac was our bus driver. So just imagine all of us tired seminarians packed into this bus, this big bus, driving through the streets of West Africa. And driving is not as organized as it is here.
It's a little chaotic.
It's a little chaotic, at least from our eyes. But
from our eyes.
Once we got to sort of be there for a while, you could see sort of the beauty in the chaos. Like everything just worked together. Everybody knew, like people walking in the streets and the buses and a lot of people had like scooters and things. They just knew where to go, and horns were their own language, like car horns. You knew what was being communicated by the different sounds. So again, this is some of our group. Our group was made up of our Masters of Divinity students. It's a requirement that each MDiv student goes on one of these intercultural trips. But it was also made up of a number of certificate students who were doing certificates in missional leadership. And many of those folks were seasoned ministry leaders or second, third career folks. It was really an interesting trip because we got perspectives from people who, like us, maybe fresh in ministry, fresh in our context, but also those who had been doing and working. And Donna, who is the woman who's on this far side, Donna Camarada, she's the chair of the Ghana Mission Network, which is a group within the PCUSA that connects US-based churches with mission partners in Ghana. So really having her perspective, we gained a lot.
Yeah, and the Presbyterian Church is actually pretty large in Ghana. Our partners on the ground in Ghana were of the Presbyterian Church of Ghana, which is their denominational organization. So it's a growing population there.
Yes, so the Christianity is thriving in the continent of Africa, and in some ways, even to our American eyes, was sort of overwhelming to be in. Driving down the street, you'd see huge billboards. I mean, huge billboards talking about prophetic this and apostle that and healing service this and Presbyterian church here and
Methodists.
A lot of Methodists, Presbyterians are sort of the big groups, and then of course Pentecostals. But like every 10 feet, it seemed like there was another sign for another church or another religious thing. So it was really just interesting to see. We think, especially in Richmond, I think, driving down the street, oh look, there's a church. Oh, there's another, and where it just seems we don't know any. Like these are like packed in. Like think Starbucks. Like you go down one street and there's one, and you turn around and there's like they're everywhere, all over the place. Next slide.
So this, of course, you learn a lot about a country through its food. This is very much the case in West Africa. And so this was my meal. This is at the same restaurant. This was my meal that I had gotten, and it has like some of the main quintessential parts of West African cuisine, which is jollof rice, chicken, and fried plantains. That jollof rice is probably the spiciest thing I've ever eaten in my life. It was the spiciest I had eaten on that trip. And so it was too pretty not to take a photo. And we ate a lot of that on this trip. A lot of that. And it was very good.
We talk about staples, like staple foods, but in America we are really diverse. Like we have a diversity of choices, and staple foods change from family to family. In Ghanaian culture, there really are there are 4 staple foods, and everyone eats those all the time, and there's not much diversion from that. So there's jollof rice, there's fufu, which is basically sort of ground cassava, which is sort of turned into a kind of sticky paste type thing, and you eat it in soup. It's basically like the spoon for soup, is you sort of take it into your hands and you eat the soup that way. Soup is a big deal.
A lot of soup.
Groundnut soup and this soup and that soup. But, and then, what would you say the other one was?
They eat a lot of spaghetti. I don't know what's up with that.
They do, that's true.
It's not
like Chef Boyardee or
not
like marinara sauce.
Tomato-based sauce spaghetti, but just like spaghetti. Like we had spaghetti for breakfast most mornings. They use it in a lot of stir fries, Asian-inspired meals, and I would say that the Asian-inspired meals are popping up more and more because China is investing a lot of money into Ghana, which has its problems, but it's interesting to see that fusion in cuisine because of that. There's only like one Burger King and one KFC that we saw, but there are a lot of like Chinese takeout places, which is very interesting.
But we stayed with the host family, and we'll get into that later. We would ask people like, what was their favorite food, and almost everybody would say fufu. Just because there are just, at least in Ghanaian cuisine, there are so few dishes, and that was not necessarily our favorite, but it was interesting. Next slide, please.
Next slide. We're taking too long. We're talking about food, and it's
This
lunchtime.
is us. If you couldn't guess it, our beautiful faces.
Yeah, I know how you were saying earlier about how I'm glad this isn't zoomed in because we looked really tired. Well, I forgot that, we put this photo in, which is from that restaurant, and we were so tired. We were so tired. Those are the clothes we were wearing on the plane. I mean, we were exhausted. Next slide, please.
So this is where we're sort of getting into the actual itinerary of the trip. We were hosted by a congregation. It was Ben Niti's home congregation, and it's
Calvary.
Yeah, Calvary Presbyterian Church, McCarty Hill. They have to be that specific because, again, there are so many. So it's like Calvary. There are so many Calvaries. There are so many like Trinities and stuff. So this was the congregation. It sort of is set up on this hill, and it looks out over the city of Accra. So we're in the southern region of Ghana, sort of close to the sea. And they had recently just built this sanctuary. It was sort of striking to me that they chose a lot of bright colors, like the yellow and the red. Just they're meaningful colors in Ghanaian culture, but at the same time, to paint entire buildings that was just something that struck me.
It definitely makes it stand out. You can see it from the highway. Like you can't see other churches.
Yeah.
So.
Next slide. So this is the inside of the sanctuary. There are balconies around the whole building, and in many ways, it looks like it has all the elements of a Presbyterian church you would sort of find here, right? There's the pulpit on the right and the table in the middle. all of the elders would sit behind. So all those chairs that are on the platform there, every active ruling elder would be sitting back there. And then to the left here, underneath the banners, were the seats for all of the past ruling elders. So there's still those vestiges of sort of cultural hierarchy even within the church, and how that's showing people honor in the positions that they take. And even in some congregations, Presbyterian congregations, even the pews themselves are segregated, not necessarily by gender, but by social rank. So the sort of elders would sit closer to the front, and then so on and so forth. So,
I will, before we go to the next slide, I will say, so the Ghanaian flag, if you've not seen it, we probably should have included a map and a picture of the flag in this, it has gold, red, and green with a black star in the middle, which is which signifies their sort of independence. And so you'll see the green and red, and so I asked somebody, I was like, this is really cool. Are these colors significant to the Ghanaian flag? And the woman turned to me and said, no, those are Christmas decorations. We just haven't taken them down yet. Which I thought was funny.
Now, the perspective of this picture is pretty big. You can move to the next slide. It was a huge sanctuary. I mean, it was probably in comparable in some ways to, maybe not as tall, but in terms
as long,
of
but big, yeah.
seating. They had also had sort of mixed worship, so they had traditional Ghanaian hymns, hymns from the English hymns from the Presbyterian hymn book, and then also more contemporary. So in many ways, it was interesting how it sort of mirrored Westminster in those ways, that there was this sort of mix of worship styles. Next slide.
So this here is, I'm in the background there. Goodness, I cannot remember his name. That is a shame. He's the pastor of Calvary, the sort of head pastor. They had more than one. He's a really great guy, very charismatic, was extremely welcoming, and he helped organize like our host families, because our host families, most of them came from this particular church. Me and Noah's host family came from a Methodist church. We'll get to that later. And so this is their sort of upper room in the church, comparable to, it's just their meeting room. And so we spent a lot of time doing different things in this room. It was like our a base in some ways. Next slide, please. Oh, she's going backwards. Were we included the same slides? I don't know.
Keep going forward. Okay, so while this is going, does anybody remember the Pentecost worship service that we had here when when we first had that partnership, and how very long it was? Yeah, that's standard.
Yes.
The worship service was 3 hours long.
And it was hot.
And there wasn't probably 2 hours before even the minister got up to preach. Now, it didn't feel that long because there was a lot of like dancing and movement. So there was actually participation in a different way than just standing in a pew for 3 hours. That would sort of be terrible. But worship was more engaging in some ways. And if anybody calls Presbyterians frozen chosen, as we do, they are not in Ghana.
This is a view from the church that we were talking about earlier. You can really see out all across the city, the valley. It's very hilly in this particular area. It's a very densely populated city. It's the capital, and it's near the water, so they get a lot of humidity. And we were there during their dry season. They only have 2 seasons, dry season and the rainy season. We were actually grateful to be there during the dry season because the mosquitoes were a lot less. That was another part of our trip. We had to take anti-malarials the entire time we were there and then after we got back. And it was really nice to not be on those anymore, but we didn't really have that many mosquitoes, which was nice. Noah, you want to talk about?
This again is our group with the pastor. The church also had a school, and they hosted various children from the community. And churches, again, are really sort of the core of Ghanaian social life in many ways, because those same sort of what we might call tribal connections that existed before have sort of shifted into the religious communities. So everything is sort of interwoven in that sense. And so really people try to take care of each other. And so this is just a great group picture. Next slide.
So this, I think I took this from the seat in our bus. Noah and I had to sit in the front because we get motion sick. This just is to show you how crowded it is on the streets. I don't know if we included a picture of this, but I'll talk about it now. Something that happens a lot in Ghana is when you're at a stoplight, people come out of the rafters and they sell you things from baskets they're carrying on their head or coolers they're carrying, and we saw a whole plethora of things. I mean, from water to belts to children's coloring books to food items, tissues, toilet paper. In Ghana, the economy pretty much, most people live off of side hustles. That's just the crass way of putting it. Even our host family, who the mother was a banker, the father worked for the president of Ghana. They ran a toilet paper store because she was like, this is the life we want to live, and we have an extra business, and that's just very common. So lots of people trying to sell you things. Next slide. Another street photo. Next slide. So this is probably the tourist destination in Accra, is this the Black Star monument. And this is our group right in front of it. This is in this big complex that was built to commemorate the independence, that's what I'm looking for, from British colonial rule, which happened in 1957. And the Black Star represents this independence, so you'll see it everywhere in Ghana. It's on the center of their flag, and so you can actually go up to the star, but someone tried to charge us. It's a public monument, so we were like, we're not gonna do that. So it's very significant. This compound, I think we might have another photo, but this compound has a huge stadium, like a big open area with bleachers around it where they hold independence festivals, other gatherings, things like that. It's where the man who sort of liberated Ghana, Kwame Nkrumah, delivered his speech declaring independence, and it's a very significant place in Ghana, and it's right on the ocean, so you can actually access the ocean from this point as well.
Which somebody also charged us for. It was a public beach.
Yeah. It's a lot of things. People will take initiative to charge you for things that they don't own.
Next slide. So this is part of our trip is we were visiting organizations, churches, historical monuments, but also universities. So this is the University of Cape Coast, and a group of us went to be with the Department of Religion and Human Values? Human ethics, something like that. Which is basically like the religious studies department of the university. So this is actually a class, and we heard a lecture from one of their professors, and then Dr. Anne-Marie Mingo gave a lecture on MLK's trip to Ghana. So he made a trip to Ghana during his time, and that was really important in his sort of move in civil rights. So we don't talk about it, I don't think, in our sort of learning of MLK, but the trip to Ghana, and actually a number of people who are influential in U.S. civil rights made trips to Ghana because it was sort of this shining star of a nation governed by Africans free from colonial power. So that's a whole lot of history. The lecture that we received from their professor was actually on the commodification of religion
In Ghana.
by neo-Pentecostal prophets. So, I mean, very technical, but again, sort of culture coming into religion. There are sort of superstitions around using sort of common objects to bring prosperity or healing or other stuff. So these neo-prophetic folks would use like special bars of soap that you're supposed to wash yourself with, and then Jesus will give you money, or so sort of this prosperity gospel stuff coming from the U.S. influencing the religious landscape of Ghana, paired with sort of the traditional framework of how the world works, how things are interconnected, and how doing stuff with very simple objects can actually affect the outcome of your life. So it's very interesting how these things were coming together. So that was just some interesting talks. Next slide.
Next slide. So this, no, I don't think you were with me for this. So University of Cape Coast, a really good way to describe it is think of like Virginia Tech. It's a huge university. They have comparable number of students to a university like Virginia Tech, and it's sort of its own city. It's sort of all enveloping in this area. It's the big economic, the economic flow in this area is the university, and so a lot of students go off to do really, really great things, and these are some of those students. I snuck a photo. This is an evening on campus. After classes got out, me and a couple of other people from our group decided to go for a walk. We were living on the campus in these sort of chateaus for a couple of days there, and so we came across this pineapple stand where the students were chopping up fresh pineapple, and I don't know what we paid for it, probably like a few CDs, which is the currency of Ghana. And so we dug into this. One of our friends, Alexis, she's great at inquiring into things, and so she pushed a little and was like, well, what's with the pineapple stand? You know, is this just a side business? Do you collect the pineapples? Did you grow them? And this is actually students from the agricultural department. And they've been studying how to grow pineapple, which is a major export for Ghana, in more sustainable ways, what this means for the economy of Ghana, what are the environmental impacts. And so they grew these pineapples and were selling them, and you know, their professor actually was out there as well with the truck, and so their professor talked to us about all the stuff they're doing in their classes, and it was really interesting how they're incorporating business into sort of environmental agricultural policy and envisioning what this is going to look like in the future, especially with worries about the climate and things like that. The pineapple we were eating is sugarloaf pineapple, which you cannot buy in the United States. They do not export it because it's better than gold pineapple. And so they keep it for themselves, which they should because it's very good. And they export the MD2 pineapple, which is what we get here in the United States. And sugarloaf pineapple is far superior to MD2 pineapple. So that was a lot of fun, a good memory, just hanging out with students on campus. Next slide.
Yeah, so Department of Religion and Human Values.
Human values. Yeah.
Next slide. We had a really lively discussion with a number of students about religion and politics, so how those intersect in Ghana and in the United States. Something that we learned is that Ghanaians know more about what's happening in the world than
Americans.
any American.
It was insane.
I know many of you, and I know your informedness, but just like take it to the next level, and that's the average college student. Just because, I think unlike the United States, who we sort of see ourselves as, we can do this on our own, and we're sort of not isolated, but we can stand alone in the world. Ghana and Ghanaians see themselves as really interconnected with the rest of the continent and with the rest of the world, so they could talk in detail about the political conflicts in Nigeria, because all of that affected them directly. Right. And so the level of knowledge that they had about what was happening in the world and the depth that they could talk about it, and they're just college, these are undergraduate students, these are not master's students or anything like that. It was really astounding. It really showed me how little I actually know about what's happening in the world. And that we got in a really fiery is a good word, debate about how politics is sort of wielding religion for its own use. I mean, just very, very interesting stuff.
And another point, which is really pertinent, I think, to American culture as well, because I think we're seeing this too, is something that they talked about a lot, and that is very important to them, some of the students, which led to the heated discussion, mostly between their professors and their students, but this idea that capitalism is becoming a new colonial power. So one of the examples they gave was Chad, which is a country that is near Ghana. We actually met someone from Chad at a later portion of our trip, speaks fluent French, because the French were the colonial power that controlled Chad for many, many years. And while one of the students was making the point that while Chad might not have direct colonial power over, or while France might not have direct colonial power over Chad, they do economically. So he was making the argument that countries in Africa really have not been fully liberated because they are not liberated economically. They're being controlled economically by the European countries that once were had power over them, and also by other countries that are entering the economic realm in Africa, like China and Russia, which is the big players right now are China and Russia. And the gentleman here, who you're seeing talking, his name is Festus. And I mention him because I was wearing a VCU shirt while I was there, and he was like, VCU? You mean like Virginia Commonwealth? He was like, I'm waiting to hear back on my master's application there. A lot of students who graduate, they go on to get several master's degrees, often in the United States, and then go back to Ghana. They find that they want to further their education and get doctorates, PhDs, masters here, and go back to Ghana after they get their preliminary education and master's degrees here.
Well, and there still is sort of a prestige that's given to American education over sort of Ghanaian
We met
education.
several people who were applying, 2 of which had applied to VCU. Festus for, I think, education and environmental stuff. But
And then later in our trip, we met a couple of seminary folks who went to Virginia Union, right? So like people that we had much closer connections to than you would think.
yeah, we had no idea. It just happened because we're wearing a t-shirt, so.
Next slide. This is a group of us and their professors and some of their students. So.
Yeah.
And this department, the sort of major religions, so we talked about Christianity, sort of the major religion. Islam is sort of the second. So as many churches as you see, you'll see mosques. And they're not necessarily huge mosques. Sometimes, well, often, they were almost above stripped, like strip mall, almost. They would be built on top of them, so they'd have stairs that go up. So you're like, there are businesses like a hairdresser and a market, and then there's a mosque on top of it. Like, so it's very interesting that these things are all interwoven. And many of the students talked about how the relationship between Muslims and Christians is much more amicable than it is anywhere else, especially in comparison to their neighbor Nigeria, where there is active conflict around religion. They've actually decided, or they work towards in Ghana, to have much more amicable relations between faiths.
So
Next slide.
We have like 15 minutes, so we're gonna. This is probably what we should be spending the most time. It's hard not to like get into the train of thought when we're reminiscing. So this is probably the most important thing that we did on this trip, and that was to go to 2 slave castles on the in Cape Coast. There's 3 or 4 of them. We went to the 2 largest ones. As you can imagine, this was a particularly emotional day. We went from one to the other, and so we often get confused because they're very similar. So this was from the first one we visited. Was this Cape Coast Castle? Yeah, Cape Coast Castle. I think also known as St. George's Castle. I think this one was ruled by the British and actually used by the British until the 50s when they left, not for exporting slaves as we know, but for like just administration buildings, which is kind of weird. So I think from the Gold Coast, it's estimated that about 1 million Africans were shipped out from the Gold Coast and brought to this continent. If we did an ancestry of sample population here in Virginia of African Americans, we could probably trace them back to the Gold Coast. It was growing up in a city like Richmond that has a lot of history when it comes to the slave trade. When you go back to Revolutionary time, Civil War time, it was very impactful, I think, for both of us to be on the other end where the ships left instead of being here where the ships came. So next slide. So this is something that you'll see all around these castles. It's a little blurry, but they're memorials, often left by people who are not Ghanaian. So a lot of Americans will make pilgrimages to the African Americans in particular, pilgrimages over to these castles and do their tours as a sort of a healing, sort of some closure around the history that we have here in the United States, but that started over here. And so next slide, please. It's hard to tell, but this is a mound of those memorials. So that one in the previous slide is probably like, in this one room we were in, which was a holding cell, was just piled high with them, and they have messages on them. Now, the more negative side to this is that Ghana found that they could make a very lucrative profit over the tourist aspect of this. So they started sponsoring these pilgrimages for people in the United States to come, and they sell these memorials and things like that. It is something that they make a lot of money off of, but they do control these spaces now, which is actually really beautiful. They determine what happens to them. They want to tell the story on their own terms, and that is something that is really cool. But yes, these memorials are all over the place.
Yeah, it is interesting how they want to preserve these slave dungeons, that they want to continue to tell the story because it is so important to them that it not be forgotten, that there are plaques, I wish I put a picture in, but there are plaques that speak to the fact that even trying to repent for their own complicitness, like tribal leaders' complicitness in selling each other to European enslavers, and trying to show these castles as monuments, not of glorifying any kind of past, but in saying that this can't happen again. And so people who come here must know the horrid truth of what it's like for the enslaved people. And so slaves throughout Africa, so people would be brought not just from Ghana enslaved, but people from Nigeria and Chad would be routed through these dungeons and brought to, in many times, Virginia. So there's a direct connection between these slave castles and our own city.
And the Caribbean was also a major receiver from the Gold Coast, places we would now call Haiti and Dominican Republic and Cuba and these places. So those are original cannons from the time of the colonial rule, and what is sort of ironic is that it is an incredibly beautiful area. I mean, the sea is, it's not Virginia Beach. It's really beautiful, and we happened to be there when there was a sunset, and it's hard because you're like, you want to take pictures, with it in the background, but you're in this really devastating place, and they are giant graveyards. I mean, hundreds of thousands of people died on these complexes. Next slide. So again, talking about graveyard, there's some graves there. Some of those are actually enslavers who died while they were living there, and they were buried in the complex. This, I think, is the second castle.
What's important about this is this building to the left here, you see the sort of the columns, that's actually the Anglican church that was built there. So most of this above is like living quarters and administrative offices, but this is the church. And then you see underneath the sort of arched door, do you see that? That goes straight into the male dungeon.
Yeah, right underneath the church.
So like it is right above.
And something that it was particularly gruesome and intriguing at the same time was in the slave dungeon. When we were down there, they took us down there first. One of the things is it's very slick and thick, and that's because any form of human excrement or anything was sort of caked down over time onto the ground, and it's still there.
Yeah, it was fossilized.
It's fossilized
into stone.
So they've removed chunks of it and sent it off to labs, and they've discovered that it is actual there's human DNA in it. But when we were in the dungeon, there was this one big room we were in, and there was light pouring down from this little hole, and that hole is right outside the front door of the church. So when people were going in and coming out of the church, they could smell and hear and look down into the dungeon. And I can't imagine how awful it was, and how that it wasn't there to make them think about what they were doing. It was there for them to say, this is what we've accomplished. This is what God is doing for us, in their minds, which is pretty horrific.
One more thing about the ground in the dungeon. They had taken out an area, and there was brick underneath, and the layer of this calcified was about this thick.
Yeah, of human excrement and
sand, because they were trying
all these things that had sort of fossilized and caked onto the thing.
And
you do have to be really careful because it's very slick, very slick.
And so I think that was, for me, that made it like the most real.
Yeah.
That this wasn't, I think, I've been to a lot of monuments and a lot of historic houses, and you're like, oh, this is great, but you can't actually see, can't actually experience the history in the same way. But that took me to a different place, because you could see literally the impact of the hundreds of thousands of people, just men. The women's dungeon was somewhere else, that were impacted by our practices. Yeah. Next slide.
Is this the church? No, this is not the church in the other one. This is just a meeting room. This is our group. That is our tour guide on your right. The other one's name was Nathaniel. I know that. That's Thomas. Thomas was our tour guide. He was really wonderful. Most of these tour guides are students at the university. They're in the history department, and this is their student job. This is how they make money, but this is also part of their education as well. So next slide. This is that sunset I was talking about. I mean, we were looking through, this photo I took through a window in the governor's quarters. And they had some really impressive digs in these castles. And so you're standing there, I'm like, wow, this is really nice. And look at this view. And it's literally right over top of dungeons. And this is how they lived.
Next slide.
Next slide. So this is the door of no return at the second castle we went to. The door of no return at the first castle was much different. It's it's this little sliver door that only one human being could fit through at a time, and that was for counting purposes. And this is the door of no return at the other one. This is the last, when they came out of the dungeons, they went through this and were put on a ship and sent. This is the door of no return. What is really beautiful about this particular door, and we don't have a picture of this, hindsight's 2020, is when you go out, we all got to walk through this door. On the other side, there's a plaque that says door of return. And the point that the tour guide made to us was this, of all the things that happened here, it is no longer this way. And we get to return. We get to walk back through that door and go back to our lives. And so it was a very touching moment, that they put this sign up there that said door of return. You can come back now. And that plays into some of the tourist stuff,
But there was also, I forget when this was, but relations between Ghana and the United States were growing stronger, and so there were a number of people, there were 2 people's remains that were buried here. They were enslaved, and their families gave permission that they would be returned back to Ghana, and they sort of did this ceremony where they took their remains back through the door, this one, in the coming direction, in trying to sort of make recompense for the horrors that were done to them.
Next slide.
Shifting gears, we'll just sit for a second. Just like,
very
there were
heavy.
also beautiful moments and happy moments and really other interesting moments. This is actually a tribal chief's house. So
Palace is what
Palace, I'm sorry. There is, there's the official government, and just like the United States, right, regional governments and that, but there are still sort of the tribal entities still exist and still have power over people's lives. Not, in some ways it's more ceremonial these days, but there is, again, because culture and politics can't be separated. They're sort of, and so political state politicians have to work in partnership with tribal leaders and vice versa to sort of get things done. Next slide. So this is, the chief is in the middle, and then these are some of the elders of this community, and then all of us. Do you want to say what we did?
We did a naming ceremony. So in Ghana, depending on the day that you're born, you get your Ghanaian name, which is technically your first name. So all the women in Ghana share 7 names, and all the men in Ghana share 7 names, but they also have their, more commonly used name. And so we went through a naming ceremony. This is also a touristy thing. We paid to have this done, and we got our Ghanaian names. I'm a female born on Tuesday, so I'm Abena, and you're a male born on Tuesday, so you're Kwabena. So we got our Ghanaian names, and we got these certificates that said we were honorary Ghanaian citizens. It was very cute. But
it was used, when we paid, he's running a school and trying to...
He runs a school, so they're trying to get a computer lab started, and so it does go, I say it more cynically, but like everywhere, they find what works for them. So the chief is in the middle there, right behind the tiger statue, and the colorful, more you can see greens, reds, blues on him. He actually lived in the U.S. for a real long time. He worked in corporate world, and his father died, and then he was like, well, I'm up. So he went back and fulfills his role as the tribal chief. So he speaks, a lot of Ghanaians speak English, but he was able to help educate us and bridge the American Ghanaian divide in a different way since he had lived here for so long. So yeah, next slide. I told you you could use this photo, didn't I? Okay. So this was one of the fun things we did. We went to Kakum National Park, which is this beautiful, hundreds and hundreds of acres national park in Ghana. And one of the biggest touristy things, if you're going to go to Ghana, is you do the canopy walk. And the canopy walk is 15 stories in the air, and very shaky, very narrow. Only 5 people can be on one stretch of the canopy at a time. So if the group in front of you is a little slow on the tree house next, you have to stand on that canopy and wait for them. And it is terrifying. So
yes. Yeah, because, okay, so you look down at the feet.
Those are treetops under us. Those are big trees. That was...
And what we're walking on are basically ladders that have been strewn together with boards on top of them. I'm not kidding. They're literally ladders.
Safe.
It's very safe.
No one has ever died on the cocoon,
but it doesn't feel that way when you're on them and you're sort of going up and down.
They're bouncing and they're swaying. And again, only 5 people, which feels a little terrifying when they're like, no, don't go yet. They're still on there. And it's not one bridge. Like, this was not the feat we had to conquer. It is like 7 or 8 canopy bridges connected by tree houses, 15 stories in the air, with minimal siding. And so once you're on the first one and you get to that tree house and the next group of 5 has started, you're doing the next 7 through the forest. It was intense.
So it's like once you start.
Yeah.
Were there lasers, or was it just?
No, it was just the netting on the side.
There was a little bit of net underneath, but not super far.
It was very safe.
In case something were to happen, but
no. Yes.
You just walked, yeah. It was wild.
Yeah. And the guide, he's like, okay, there's this one part, and this is, there's 2 bridges, and then there's your off. If you're too scared, you can get off. But after that, you committed. Have 6 more, so you're committed. So you have to make a decision.
It was painfully high up in the air. I mean, it was just crazy.
It was real fun. It's worth it. In hindsight.
It was. So this is the Acrophie Kristaller Institute. This is an institute that is centered on religious education. I wouldn't say it's a seminary. They would not call themselves a seminary. Usually people who have been to seminary and are religious leaders and scholars come here for further reflection and education. And so here we are in the classroom. We're getting a presentation from a woman who is a Kenyan religious scholar. She's Dr. something, I cannot remember her name. We were super tired in this room, so I think I'm actually asleep.
Vala in Gina.
In Gina, yeah. And this is our group photo outside of Acrophie Kristaller.
So what their sort of push is translating the Christian faith into the African context. So people come from all across the continent to study here because they see the value of translating the faith, not just literally, but concepts and frameworks into their own cultural context and seeing the value of that. And so we sort of bookended our trip with the castles and with this trip to Acrophie Kristaller to sort of contrast the ways in which Christianity has been used and is being used,
right,
for propping up enslaving free peoples, but then on the other side, that there's still life to our faith, that it's not the faith itself that's evil, it's how it's being used.
And that African leaders and scholars and religious leaders are leading the theological conversations now. You're like, people from the U.S. and people from Europe, we typically, when we think of old, scholars and theologians who influence our theology today, they're often, white men from European contexts. And here, these are all African theologians. They are leading. They are determining their theological stances on things based on their African context, which is really cool. They have their own library. It's really neat.
And I know we're at our end of time, but we met with the woman who's sitting is Mercy Odioye, who was the first African woman to receive a PhD in theology, period. She was a big leader in the World Council of Churches and in really trying to bridge this gap between sort of indigenously formed theologies in Africa and sort of the Eurocentric theologies that we that we find in the U.S. and in Europe. So she's a big player, and it was really an honor to meet with her because she's growing old, but she still has sort of the sharpness of mind. So if anybody knew, I know Jess does, Katie Geneva Cannon, they're sort of, I would say that they were the mirror image of each other in terms of Katie Geneva Cannon was sort of womanist African-American theology in the U.S., and Mercy Odeoye is that same sort of move, but in the continent of Africa.
Yeah, and I'm not there. I was in bed with motion sickness, so I feel bad that I didn't get to meet her. But
next slide. And then we also visited the W.E.B. Du Bois Center. So you might not know, he actually died in Ghana and is buried in Ghana. He saw Ghana as this sort of haven for African intellectual thought, African freedom, and some of the values that he espoused. He saw in Ghana. He was invited by the president, Nkrumah, at that point, to come over, and he did a lot of work there. But this was his main residence. Next slide. And this is actually his grave, so he's buried underneath of here. And so people will visit and sort of same thing, leave memorials and such like that. Next slide. At this point, I'm so sorry, we're really at the end of our time.
Yeah, we really are.
Okay, we're with our host families now. Our host family, she was a banker. He was assistant to the president of Ghana. They lived in this basically housing complex, but
it was huge.
And with all of their family, but they still there aren't sort of grocery stores like we have in the U.S. There are still outdoor markets, and so these are just some images of the market. No, go back. Other way.
We're being told to hurry up.
Okay. So on the right, that's an open air butcher. So think like if we were at an open air butcher outside right now, this is like it all the time. On the left is other foods. Most of the sort of stuff on the shelf there is smoked fish. So fish is actually a big part of Ghanaian diet. Next slide.
This is Kwame Nkrumah's statue in a big complex to him. Our host family took us with their 3 little kids, which was so much fun. That's a statue of Kwame Nkrumah. Behind him, that big structure is the mausoleum for him, and that is his final resting place there. And he's been reburied like 3 times, so they're hoping this is the last time. It's an incredible complex. Next slide. This is in the museum portion. They have a lot of educational resources on this complex to learn about him, about Ghana's independence. In the background of this picture on your right is a car. That's the car that John F. Kennedy gifted to Kwame Nkrumah in the late 50s, early 60s. Next slide. This is the church that we went to with our host family. This is their home church, Grace Society. It's a Methodist church, part of the big, I guess I can't say global Methodist now. That means something different now. But we went to church with them on our very last day there. Like, we went to church and then we hopped on a plane, and it was really incredible. Next slide.
They had just built this complex. So it was basically a circle, and there were balconies above, and they were still building it. So it was in enough use that you could worship in the space, but you could definitely see like unpainted drywall and wires and things. Like, it was just very interesting how the use of places, they were just sort of in process of building, but they still used it. Side note again about worship, the Methodists were more frozen than the Presbyterians, so
it was
stick that
very
in your pocket.
Similar to a Methodist service here. Yeah, like only hymns. There was dancing during the offering. They dance and give their offering, but other than that, it was like going to a Methodist church here. Next slide. That might be it. Maybe not. I think that's it. Maybe.
Yeah, that's it. That's it. Thank you. Thank you. We are at the end of our time, but are there any questions?
Did you take any other pictures of the residence where you were staying? You said it was big and huge. I
We do have photos of it. It was this beautiful house they built. They were still doing some renovations to the upstairs of it. We stayed in their guest house, which was also very nice, which has like 3 bedrooms and a full bathroom, living area. It was another house. And then they had like 6 luxury cars, which was really cool. And yeah, definitely not. I think a lot of people, when they think of Ghana or they think of countries in Africa, they think of people who are poor and desolate and need our help. And while there is some of that, especially in the north of Ghana, Accra is a bustling city. It's an economically booming area, and
Well, and we had to change our sort of presuppositions of what that looked like, because a bustling city here is different than a bustling city there, right? So some of the indicators that we might think of as poverty, like dust or walking on the street, or like just the things that our culture's been taught are signs of poverty and
are
not the same. So we really had to change our expectations and say, okay, no, we're literally entering a different place, a different culture, a different cultural framework. So we have to look at it through that and not through our sort of American eyes.
Dust was economic activity.
Yeah, it was just everywhere, right? Because it was a dry season, of course. So I mean,
it's a very clayy soil.
Yeah, the whole country is sort of, at least in the south, red, like just because
red clay. Yeah.
Based on the colonialism, is it kind of an international vibe going on there, or is it primarily almost just exclusively people from Ghana, born in Ghana, that make up the population now?
It's mostly Ghanaians. We saw very few people who weren't. I mean, when we were at the educational institutes, there are students from Nigeria, Chad, other countries. A lot of American tourists were there at the same time. We ran into a couple of Mormons doing their thing, and
at a resort.
But it is mainly we saw them at the resort. So take that with that what you will. But you can see the influences for sure. So like we have African American people here in the U.S. with last names like Jefferson, Washington, things like that harken back to that time. One of the professors, his last name was Anderson, because the Dutch controlled Ghana for a long time. And so he descends from where this sort of mixed during that colonial time, with all the positive and negative things that came with that. So you see things like that for sure.
But there's definitely international influence.
Yeah, influence, yes.
Like the Chinese restaurants and the Chinese businesses, and Nestle has a big firm there. Like, you see the sort of encroaching globalism that is just there.
All right.
So thank you, everybody, for staying and learning about the trip to Ghana. And before we let them go, I would like us all to say a prayer for them and for their ministry as they move from this place. Pray with me. Gracious and loving God, we thank you for Noah and for Addison. We thank you for their opportunity to go to Ghana to learn more about your world and about Christianity and the people who are moving in your spirit, in your way, around our world. We ask that you bless them, Noah and Addison, that you bless their ministry that you've set before them. We thank you for the gifts they've brought to us. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen. Thank you, my friends.